Hey folks, good afternoon. We are so excited to be hosting today about a incredibly important topic that I think that is infecting all of us, and that is in race and equity in admissions and recruitment. I'm Josh Bostромowitz, part of the Two Enrollment Guys. Just before we get started, as you'll see to your bottom, there is the chat function. This is a great way to just kind of pop in, say, hey, where you're coming from, and then also any questions that you may have either for us or for Turan during this conversation, feel free to post them there. We're going to be observing it. And then we also have an opportunity at the end for question and answer. So in case this is your first webinar, like I said, I'm Josh Bostромowitz. I've been in education for 15 years, really at two very different institutions, a medium-sized public institution and then a very small private institution. So really enjoyed my time there, really experienced in communications, in the campus visit experience, and implemented Slate at my last institution. So I'll turn it over to Corey and let him tell you about the master himself.
Oh yeah, master, there we go. Hey everybody, welcome. Welcome back for those who've been here before. As Josh says, my name is Corey Baker. I've been in admissions or higher ed related 13, 14 years now. I think after 10, you just stop counting and just assume it's more. I've done the traditional recruitment from freshman transfer, visit days, CRM implementation, left higher ed on the traditional recruitment sense, went over and did CRM implementation, came back to higher ed for a couple more years into the marketing office, and now work at the marketing agency, obviously. So really kind of the gamut of what I've been involved in within higher ed. But you know, today we're really excited to have a special guest with us. It's my good friend Turan. Josh kind of got fancy with his name, but the first time I met Turan, he made it very clear. It's Turan. You got his name clear from that moment forward. So I'm really excited that Turan's here. Turan and I met, I think it's been like 11 years ago now. We started in the trenches, traditional freshman recruitment. So we've known each other, and the cool thing is to watch Turan go from, I think when we met, he was about a year out of college, and then continue to grow not only in admissions, but in higher ed, but then move over to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and continue to grow in his roles at my old school alma mater, Maryville University. And, you know, the exciting part to see him continue to grow, even though I'm not there, is to watch him grow into his newest role as senior advisor for access and opportunity at Maryville University. So without further ado, I really want to say a great thank you for being here, Turan, and let us know a little about yourself, what you're doing. Let everybody know what you're doing and some of the current initiatives at Maryville.
Sure. Thanks for the warm welcome. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, good. So yeah, Turan Mullins here, he, him, his pronouns. I've been in higher ed now for close to 12 years. Like Corey said, I spent some time at a medium-sized public institution, Southeast Missouri State, and then I've spent the rest of my career at Maryville University, moving through a couple of different positions. So assistant director of admissions, assistant director of multicultural programs, director of diversity and inclusion, assistant dean for diversity and inclusion, overseeing our service and spiritual life, Office of Diversity and Inclusion, community outreach, and then recently transitioning into the senior advisor for access and opportunity in the president's office. And so this transition allows me to work directly with senior leadership across the campus and work to make sure that we are really executing and living our mission and values of diversity, inclusion, equity, social justice, access, and opportunity. And so that looks different for every department. When working with academics, we may be looking at curriculum or faculty development. When working with admissions, we may be looking at data from different territories and populations and trying to understand the class makeup. And from working with, you know, development and advancement, we may be identifying grants and funds that we can go after. And then also just being a member of our community here locally in St. Louis and trying to make an impact in the region in terms of providing a quality education and outreach for students and faculty and staff and professionals to come work for us and be with us and really enjoy their time. So I've loved the work. People ask me all the time, how'd you get into this? How'd you get into this? true story. I was walking across campus. I recruited some students to Maryville. I was looking for them to touch base with them. There were some African-American gentlemen. They left the institution, but I couldn't figure out where they went or who was connected with them. I ended up talking to our vice president of student affairs. She said, sounds like you really have an interest in understanding what happens with students once they get on campus. I said, heck, I don't know. I just know in admissions, we work really hard to get these students here, and I would like to see them graduate. And so that conversation led me down a pathway of exploring what student affairs was and getting involved on that side of the house. And it kind of just put me on a pathway for where I'm at today.
Awesome. That's fantastic. I think that's such a story of admissions, right? Is how did you get into it? It just kind of happens. And I apologize about mispronouncing your name. I totally blame it on the bow tie. You know, it makes everything fancier than it truly is. So
no worries.
We are going to jump in because, again, this is just such a topic right now that is just so front and center. And right now we're really inundated with, you know, racial injustices and protesting and, you know, it all in the backdrop of COVID right now. The political, social, racial climate of 2020 is just so intense. How do you think our colleges and universities are doing in regarding to, you know, addressing the social justice issues and the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think like anything else, you're going to have schools that are prepared for it. Racism in America is not a new phenomenon. It's new to some people. It's not new to colleges and universities. It's just new to some campuses. And so I think that the majority of higher education institutions are doing what they naturally have done forever, right? They reflect what's going on in the world. They try to provide a space for students to grow and to think critically, ask the hard questions, and have dialogue. You're also going to have a lot of institutions that are not willing to face reality, right? I think that one thing that higher ed is grappling with is that the COVID and the pandemic is the disruptor that higher ed has needed for a very long time. I think that you have a lot of institutions that have been around for hundreds of years or tens of years or something like that. And so now you're asking yourself, all the things we said we couldn't do, we're doing. Right. And so your students have to learn remotely. Your faculty has to redesign courses. You are now probably engaging in a more digital environment than you ever had before. Right. And so when you think about what's going to happen when we come back from the pandemic, so let's say we get the vaccine out, things go back to normal, campuses come back full steam ahead, there's still issues of race and equity because we're going to reflect America. Right. And so you have some universities that have established centers with professional staff and resources and funds and support. And they've taken a true commitment from the top down senior leadership. You have other universities that are going to window dress it. Right. They're going to post a hashtag. They're going to maybe start a new scholarship or two. But that's going to be it. I think that if you're a great university, right, you've already started to create the culture and the community of inclusion way before this has happened, right? And you've also, there's a quote that I go by, commitment without currency is counterfeit. And so when you have a large campus and your diversity and inclusion office has 2 staff members, 3 staff members, and they have maybe the smallest budget in student life, you know that it's not important, right? If you ever want to see if an institution is truly dedicated, just check the finances, check the books. Right, you follow the money and it'll show you what the commitment is to the institution. And so I think it's very clear that people need to have resources and they need to have staffing, right? I think one of the most, this wasn't this year, but maybe I think 4 years ago, I was at a conference and we were talking about how we ended up in our roles just as diversity experts or leaders on our campus. And one of the guys disclosed that he was like, I was just the Black guy. I was the Black guy who actually worked in the rec center. I was one of the few Black people on campus, but we had an issue on campus. And they immediately came to me and put me now in this diversity role and told me to oversee this stuff. And I have no clue what I'm doing. I don't have the background. I don't have the expertise. I don't know the knowledge, but I feel like this is a great opportunity, but I also feel like I'm tokenized. Right. And so that story always resonated with me when I think about what schools are doing, because just like anything else, building a new major, starting a new program, changing something on campus, adding a new athletic team, it takes a strategic plan and vision and accountability measures put in place to make those things happen. So the schools that are applying that same method to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think are probably going to be better off when this all finishes up.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask you, who of the universities and colleges do you feel like are really truly living kind of that statement? Who's putting the proof in their pudding?
Sure. Maryville University, first and foremost. My game. But I think like if you follow so each state is different. And I think you have to figure out, one of the things that we had to figure out is what is applicable to us, right? And so I know Ohio State has like a huge ODI, like they have diversity inclusion, they have multicultural programs. You look at Purdue, you look at USC, some of the biggest schools, right? They have these like, I like to call them the Cadillac option, premium package diversity and inclusion systems. But I had to understand that Maryville we had a campus population of 700. We grew to about 1,000 residential students. We're about 3,000 undergrad right now. And then we have this big explosion in online, right? So I had to start looking at some other schools that were doing it well, or that I thought were doing it well, and seeing what I could borrow from them. So we looked at Elon. We looked at, oh my God, I can't name them off the top of my head right now, but there's several schools. What I always like to do is try to find the nuggets, right? So yes, we don't have the staffing capacity and the budget that Ohio State has, so we can't do all of their programs, but there's great programs that they do that I've been able to look at, right? Like they have a long-standing African-American festival, I think like a Black festival that they do, where their alumni are engaged, the whole campus community is engaged, the school is engaged. I said, wow, those are some really cool programs, and maybe we can adapt some of that. I've seen leadership programs, right, be instituted at different campuses. And so being able to kind of pick and choose some of those, really just digging into the literature. Like if there's a program that you want to, that's the great thing about higher ed. A lot of times is that there's researchers and, really strong academic people who are exploring and studying these things, and they're writing great articles and providing great resources in terms of giving us what we need to create what we want to create on our campus. So sorry if I didn't mention any of the schools out there that are doing great work. I see we have a lot of people in the chat. And so I'll say, if you guys are doing great work or you got some good programs, drop the link to your Office of Diversity and Inclusion or Multicultural Program so we can all check it out and see what we can maybe follow up and think about.
Definitely. So kind of, Turan and I, like I said, we've known each other. So back in the day when we're going to conferences, we got to share rooms together and just have fun conversations, and really that for me, obviously I'm a little more hillbilly than anybody else in here. So the nice thing about that is just the willingness and openness of other people to have conversations. So kind of digging on that for colleges and universities, though, that are struggling to find their footing right now, how do they, effectively reach BIPOC audiences with their messaging? And especially, how do you do that without seeming like disingenuous, insensitive, or pandering? Like, how do I talk about it, but I don't want to seem like I'm just doing it to save face, but I'm actually interested. I'm actually wanting to know more and get that out there from a university perspective.
Yeah, this is tough because sometimes you're trying to figure out, do I get the cart or the horse, right? And so like from an admissions perspective, I need to be able to sell our campus to students so that they want to come and learn more about it. Once I get a student on campus, I need to be transparent and honest about the experience, because I don't want to do a bait and switch. I don't want to say we're inclusive, we're diverse, we're this, we're this, we're this, get them to enroll, and then we disappear because we're out looking for the next class. And now that student is on campus looking for all the things that you promised them, and they can't find it. Now they want to transfer. Now they want to leave the school. Now they don't like the major. Now they're uncomfortable on your campus. And so this creates this cycle of not being able to be successful and graduate and really take advantage of the opportunities that higher education provides. So I think what you have to do first, if you're a higher education institution, is do an internal audit about who you are, right? And so doing a campus climate survey to really understand what your students, faculty, and staff feel like campus is like in regards to diversity and inclusion, equity. I think the next thing you have to do is really tap into your student populations. If your admissions office hasn't sat down with your, Association of Black Collegiates, your Latinx Student Alliance, your international students, your LGBTQ student organizations, your students with disabilities, all of that, you need to sit down and really talk to those students and understand, because sometimes those students are the best advocates for your campus because they chose to come there, they chose to stay engaged, and they're most of the time doing a lot of work on campus to make your campus a lot better. right? And so understanding what those issues are and what those groups and supports are, then you're able to communicate that to students, right? And so I used to always tell students when I was recruiting early on in Maryville, I said, listen, we're not the institution that we hope to be. But if you're a strong leader and you want a great academic experience and you think that a small school would be for you, let's have a deeper conversation about what that can look like. Because a lot of times students don't really know exactly what they want. They don't know if they want a party school. They don't know if they want, a rural school. They don't know. Some students know. Some students know absolutely this is what I want, but a lot of students just don't know. And so I think being exposed to things helps them decide if this is what they want or don't want. And so I would say, again, doing an internal audit and really having clarity about who you are as an institution and where you want to go, and then getting with admissions and your external marketing group, your MediaCross people, and saying, okay, how do we really tell this story about where we're at and where we're going, right? There's nothing wrong with, reaching out to students of color and showcasing what your students of color are doing on campus, right? But there is something wrong with hiring actors to come sit inside your cafeteria to take photos to make it look like you have students of color on your campus and you don't. Or going to approach the one trans student that you have on campus and making them the poster child for trans inclusion on your campus. You can't, you need to be able to do that. And then also, again, listening to, if you haven't, lean in and ask your Office of Diversity and Inclusion, multicultural programs, what's going on campus? How do we really feel? What can we be working on? Because that office is doing this work day in and day out, 365. And a lot of times they're not at the table, they're not consulted, they're not talked to when people are thinking about other things to do, like external messaging, because there's such an internal focus, right? But I think what's helped us out at Maryville is being able to communicate internally what's going on, for diversity and inclusion to live outside of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, so it's in all the other functions of our campus, and then just being honest about where we're at, right? Like I tell students, you may be the only Black person in a class still. That's a reality on our campus. I'm not going to sell it to you like you're going to, but I'm also going to say that we have tons of programming outside of the academic classroom that you'd engage in to find community. And I tell people all the time about my story, right? Like here I am on a webinar series right now with two white guys, right? We're going to have to communicate. We're going to have to talk about uncomfortable issues. Corey even talked about it. We were roommates at a conference one time and got a chance to just listen and talk to each other. And so I think that's what, for me, that's why I chose to go to not go to a HBCU, is because I wanted to go to a college or a university where I did have diversity and I was a little bit outside of my element. And I get why sometimes students want to go to HBCUs, right? Because they want to feel connected to that culture, that identity. So I think these problems also, let's not sugarcoat it either. HBCUs also have inclusion issues as well, right? And so just because something is monolithic in a way, or it is homogeneous in a way, it does not mean that the layers of diversity, inclusion, equity, social justice are not present inside of that that system, that organization, and that community.
Really strong points here. And that is the fact of you've got to get out and talk with your students, right? You've got to hear their experiences and to know firsthand exactly kind of what they're going through, both the positive and the negative. And then I think even more so, something that a lot of universities have done is they've introduced this Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And that's where diversity inclusion lives. And I think it is such a critical point that you made. And I think a couple of people on the chat kind of agree that it has got to, while I think it can be housed there, it's got to live into the campus infrastructure, in the bones, in financial aid, in student life, in admissions. It's got to be a campus that truly embraces that.
Yeah, because it does mean nothing if I can recruit a student and tell them how great it is, and they go to financial aid office and they feel microaggressions all day, or they feel slighted as a student of color. I think you also have to really just, again, listen to the students and be able to identify what success looks like. It's not enough to say that your incoming class was 30% students of color last year if your graduation rates for those same students of color is less than your graduation rates for white students. That's the goal. Right? If you see your white students graduating at a 97% rate and you look at your other demographics and you start to see 16 and 17%, until we get those numbers equal, then we're not going to have equity, right? And sometimes it's going to take more resources to say, okay, why don't any of our students of color pass this course? right? How are we going to talk to that professor? How are we going to build some resources to it? How are we going to make sure that these, again, doing that analysis really helps you figure out where students are falling off track in terms of graduation. I think that those are the places that you want to, strengthen and support, so that as you're recruiting students, they're able to get through the programs and reach that final destination of graduation. And that's what you should be selling, right? Because that's the key part that is going to separate your institution from other institutions, like our multicultural scholars program or our our cultural competency development program that we're instituting for faculty and staff. So we're telling students that, hey, look, you can come and we're going to work on training our people to make sure that they know how to deal with you and all the nuances of diversity. You don't have to come to our campus and then teach our faculty and staff how to talk to you as a person of color. We're going to own that responsibility. We're going to make sure that our faculty understand how to communicate with all of our students, right? That's the institutional priority that has to happen.
Absolutely. I think that is such a critical component that we have to dive into the ground level. And so having said that, we talked a lot about, from an institutional standpoint, how can we make a more supportive institution in terms of diversity and inclusion? But we've got a lot of folks here that are in admissions, that are in financial aid, or campus visit experience coordinators, or even student life. When kind of talking about your campus, how can you ensure, or how can they ensure that, when they're speaking to students who fall into a diverse population or fall into the LGBTQIA population, how can they ensure that their communications, whether that, in person or over the phone or even through their emails, what are some maybe ways that they can change some of their conversation to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I think it comes with education. And so it's having trainings and reading material and doing certain things to help build your cultural competency. So when we think about, using person first language, right? That's something that we do when we're talking to people with disabilities. We don't make the disability the person. We always make sure the person comes before their disability or before whatever we're talking about, right? That doesn't just happen. I didn't know that, right? I had to sit and learn that from somebody. I actually learned it from our Office of Disability Support Services, right? They did a program talking about how to better work with those students. I've sat and I've listened to presentations and workshops on how to better work with international students through our International Student Support Center, right? So you have these people on campus that do this. I think one of the things that was really cool that our admissions department used to do is in the summertime when they were doing training, they would invite different offices to come in and have seminars and sessions to work with them. A lot of times I would spend maybe 10 minutes talking about, all right, guys, when you're on the road, you really want to sell these programs. These are now our flagship programs for Hispanic Heritage Month. And this is our cultural festival. And this is a report about the Multicultural Scholars Program, right? Read that on your off time. But now what we're going to do is a little bit of role playing and a little bit of, dialogue skills about how to engage with stuff, right? Because sometimes you're the one that's sitting in a one-on-one meeting discussing a person's future, a person's life, and some hard conversations about money, right? And so you want to really, I think the one thing that I would recommend to all people who are on this call is to really do some work around your unconscious bias, because we don't know again, it's called unconscious for a reason. It's not like you're maliciously going into a room trying to offend somebody, but maybe something that you said or the way that you perceive something has made you respond back in a way, right? And it's not the best response. And so, again, I think one of the things that I've been talking to people about is how to react and not respond, right? Or how to respond and not react. So sometimes somebody does something, you just react, right? It's instant versus taking a beat and having a pause in a moment and thinking about how do I respond and engage with something like that. So I think inclusive first language, and then really, I think the LGBTQIA community is very fluid, and there's a lot of changes, and it's such a individual experience and something like that you really want to make sure that you're constantly updating your education on that, but also giving space to know that whatever you've been taught may not also be absolutely true for the person that's in front of you, right? And so if you think like, I know this about your community, that's a misstep, right? You want to say, hey, how can I learn more about your community, or what can you tell me about your community that may be important as we develop our relationship? So there's this seek to understand piece that I'm naming here in terms of how you engage strategically and thoughtfully with dialogue when you're dealing with other people who are different than you. I also think just making sure that, again, you coming to the conversation with some general base of knowledge helps. If you walk in completely ignorant and then put the responsibility on the person to educate you, it seems unfair. It feels unfair.
Yeah, for sure. Turan, what I really liked, and you started bringing up in kind of in the middle there, you talked about how, when we were in admissions, like we would start inviting you over in the summer and we get the updates. And we were talking about what was actually happening, what the statistics actually were. But what I liked what you were mentioning is that's what we did, but now it's starting to go that step further. It's developing where now it's role playing. Now it's having a deeper understanding of how to have these conversations. So, when we worked together at Maryville over the years, I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag of this. 15 years ago or so, we had a multicultural scholarship that was there. And I would say it's very common of a lot of schools to put a multicultural scholarship in place. They say they have the scholarship, they can check it off their list and move forward. Where what I valued about what, new leadership, Dr. Mark Lombardi came into Maryville, and then conversations started happening that, we moved where it wasn't just the checking the box of having a scholarship to say that we had it. Can you talk a little bit about the path that it went from scholarship now to where what I would call more of a retention tool and graduation tool? Can you talk about that process and what the program actually is and doing now?
Sure, it's a great program. You can find it on our website at maryville.edu. Go to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and you can take a look at our multicultural scholarship program. The program originally started, like all things, you have a problem, you put resources behind it. Right, and so we had scholarships. They were nominal amounts. Students could use them, and they would get them access to the university and help pay for school. There was no program, right? And so in my first couple of years in admissions, I quickly realized that we were recruiting students, but the majority of the students we recruited for the scholarship were white students, right? And so the idea behind the scholarship was that we were going to have some funds to help improve diversity. Right, but you have to have students of color applying for that, accepting that, and then getting on campus. But we also knew that we needed white students in the program, right? Because you have to have a diverse group of people to have diverse conversations. So we didn't want to alienate any students as well. So we had to take a step back and look at it and say, strategically, what are we doing and how are we going to do it? So the first thing that at the time, our former supervisor, Dr. Christy Cruz, was tasked to do was to build the curriculum and the structure for the Multicultural Scholars Program. And so what she decided to do was to lay out a format that allowed students to understand who they were in their first year, so a strong sense of identity and self-identity and self-awareness. The second phase of it happened in the second year, and in this phase, you got to explore other cultures and different group dynamics and other things like that. In the third year, we really worked with you to understand how to communicate and lead diverse conversations. So imagine this being more like facilitation training. And then that fourth year, they were creating workshops and presentations that they would deliver out to campus. And so they would be the peer educators. Inside of this, you also have a mentorship program, right? And so juniors are mentoring first year students, faculty and staff are mentoring second year students. And then by your senior year, you either connected, right, with a professional mentor that you found, an academic advisor, friends on campus. We figure about the senior year, there's not as much of a structure to it, but you still have these networks and you still have all these ways that you've been involved. And so on top of all of this, we grew that scholarship program from maybe like 5 scholarships that we were offering $2,000 or $3,000 for, to currently we gave out, I want to say upwards of 30 plus scholarships this year, ranging from a full tuition room and board scholarship all the way down to percentages. So we took the equity approach, right? We stopped saying that 5,000 was going to be good enough for every student. Some students didn't need it. Some students are coming with an athletic scholarship, outside scholarships. So we really wanted to look at the financial aid package of students and saying, okay, how can we support as many students as possible? And then how do we get these students in a cohort model that allows them to feel supported as they go through campus? But then also we're getting output from these students because 80% of them take on some type of leadership role on campus, whether that's a resident assistant, a peer educator, a tutor, a tour guide, you name it, they probably worked it on campus. And now what we're doing is we're not only just putting our diverse students in these leadership roles, we're putting diverse culturally competent, academically strong, and supported students in these roles. They become role models, right? And so now you got students that are like, man, how can I be a part of that program? And so we had to create these other entry points to support for other students because of what they were seeing in the Multicultural Scholars Program. The program currently has over 90 students in it. We graduate students at about a 96% rate. Our first to second year retention rate is something like 98%. All of our students, we've only lost one, but all the students that have had the full tuition room and board scholarship have transitioned each year and are graduating and making awesome progress. And so, you know, it works for us. We're looking at a couple of different models to be able to replicate this so that we can get support to students who don't fall into this category or who don't get selected for the award. But the thing that changed was that, again, we hired somebody who had the foresight and the ability to create curriculum, assess what we were doing, evaluate, tweak what we needed to tweak, and make the program sustainable. Now what we're looking at is how do we change that program from being, you know, 15 students in a cohort or 5 students in a cohort to being 40 students in a cohort? And what are we going to do when we get 100 students that want to be in the cohort, right? How do we keep that same quality inside of it to support what we're doing on campus?
Super incredibly impressive. I mean, to have, I think anybody would want a 97, 98% like graduation rate of any of their population. So the fact that you're serving these students so incredibly well is just, I mean, again, talking about the proof in the pudding there.
Yeah, and let's be transparent. So when we start to see, you know, 96% graduation and retention rate for African-American males in this program, but then we look at African-American males not in this program on our campus, and we see a significant drop-off, we have to hold ourselves accountable to it, right? Because they're still Maryville students. And so I think that's the work that higher ed has to be able to do. It's not just to come out and showcase and highlight the good stuff that they're doing. How are we going to make that fair for all students across the campus, right?
Absolutely. It's not a race. There's no finish line here. And I think that there's movement for all of us to do. And I think that that's such a key component, is that as good as we are doing, there's always opportunities for us to uphold more students and to really see the success across the board.
Absolutely.
So I know that we talked specifically about kind of what's going on at Maryville, and then also kind of talked about having conversations on a campus and at that 20,000-foot view. But having conversations is one thing. And, you know, putting together a plan beyond the, you know, we're going to have a multicultural scholarship for admissions. What's your best advice for colleges and universities to kind of start actualizing a more socially just and inclusive campus?
Ooh, that is one that
not a small question at
all. Okay, so putting together a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion, you have to, I think, pull together some people on your campus that are the leaders, your leadership, right? So this season needs to happen at the presidential level and his committee and advisory group, with some insight from academic affairs, student life, financial aid. And again, you have to do, I think the first step is, so there's a couple ways of looking at it. I know in reality, everybody's not going to get the support and resources that they need to get done what they want to get done the way they want to do it, right? We're in a pandemic, things are changing, things are difficult. So the first thing that I would say would be to find the people who are willing and committed to doing this work on your campus and build that infrastructure first. Because those are people who are going to do the work. So, right, figure that out first. The second piece is you could probably look across your institution on the surface level and figure out what best practices are we not implicating right now, right? So diversity and inclusion research is very robust and deep, and you can find a lot of great information out there. So I would say start there, right? Simple things that you can be doing. Like if you don't have an Office of Diversity and Inclusion or multicultural programs, that may be your starting point. Let's create an office and a space that can champion this on campus for us. And it may start with one staff member because that's what you can afford this year, right? And that one staff member needs to be tasked with maybe doing a few things and not doing everything, right? like you said earlier, it's not a finish line, it's a journey. So if you're talking about culture change within an organization, that's a 5 to 7 year process. This doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and say, hey, we're inclusive right now, and just think that people are going to do it. So I think you have to do that. The piece that I named earlier, the assessment piece, right? Making sure you're doing some type of campus climate survey or diversity mapping across your campus so you can see what programs, what initiatives, and what resources you already have identified. Then you want to create some alignment with that, right? So whatever you have, let's align it and figure out what we're doing. And don't just do it because we've always done it that way. You know, that's the age-old saying that you don't want to have. But yeah, and then I think if I'm being completely honest, there's a lot of dynamics that comes to diversity, but one of the things that I've been taught is that you can't really talk about diversity until you're willing to talk about race. So a lot of times people are going to say diversity and they're going to want to talk about everything else but race, right? Gender, sexual orientation, all of this. But because we have to understand the context in which what we're dealing with colleges and universities inside of the United States of America. And so one thing that I adamantly disagree with is that if we don't have conversations about our history with race and racism and oppression in America, we can't truly dive into all the nuances of what we're talking about. Because when you look at gender, right? You look at women in America, the story of a white woman in America and a black woman in America and a Hispanic woman in America and an Asian woman in America and a biracial woman in America, totally different, right? But similar. You know what I'm saying? So I think like you have to really be able to be comfortable talking about those nuances because they are going to impact certain decisions and certain conversations and things that you do on campus. And so a lot of times people are so afraid of that conversation, so resistant to that conversation that they want to be dismissive of it and try to talk about these other things. But I mean, given the climate that we're seeing in America today, you know, I feel like it's just not really heartfelt if we bypass our issues with race. So to sum that up, I would say enter through race. Make sure you have some data, some equity data that you're looking at, or some campus climate survey data, and then engaging in a strategic planning or visionary process. And the strategic planning process for diversity and inclusion is very similar to the strategic planning process that you've done for other things, right? It really is setting up some goals, building in some accountability, and outlining what the resources are going to look like, and creating a timeline to get stuff done.
So Turan, speaking of those resources, you know, Josh and I, as you know, as our these two enrollment guys, we really tried to pride ourselves in all our webinars that we have takeaways. That's something that people let today, which you've already started doing. And the last question actually throughout the whole thing is conversations they can have. But what are some of the resources and content creators that would be good for admission and higher ed folks and marketers to check out that would help us with our jobs with diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'm going to recommend is a book. And so there's this book called Bias, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shape What We See, Think, and Do by Dr. Jennifer Ebenhart. It's a really good book because I think it's the one thing that, again, all of this starts with self-accountability. I can't change the world. I can't change how people are going to show up and treat me, but I can change or decide how I'm going to show up, who I'm going to be, and how I'm going to lead and approach different situations. We're going to leave all these books and names at the end of the presentation, but we can definitely drop those in. The second book that I'm going to recommend, especially if you're in a leadership role or a decision-making role, or you're aspiring to be in that role, and that's going to be Strategic Diversity Leadership by Damon Williams. And those two books are going to be the first two starting places that I think you could start just reading and doing some things. The second thing that I'm going to recommend that you do is go out to some websites and start to look at some resources. And so American Colleges and Universities, ACNU, has a great diversity and inclusion equity page on their website that talks about how to really look at this from a strategic point of view and what are some of the things that you can do there. They're very good about defining things that you can do. Because I know that the majority of you all may be in admissions or marketing or something like that, I would say maybe reach out to that Office of Diversity and Inclusion or your Division of Student Life and say, who can we talk with over there to really get a grasp about what diversity and inclusion, social justice, equity looks like on our campus, right? And then I would also say for admissions people, I know the fall is hectic and I know we're in a pandemic. So let me put context before my next statement. right? If you can, try to engage with some of the programmatic things that are happening on campus so you can really see and understand what it looks like for your current students. I think sometimes we get detached, right? We get the information about the academic programs. We have the cost of attendance broken down, and we know who we need to connect people with. But sometimes we're so busy marketing and selling the institution, we forget to be in the institution and community and really get a feel for the value that it is. I would also say if you're looking for some true deep dive professional development, Dr. Sean Harper out at USC, the Race and Equity Center, I believe, is fantastic. They actually have an executive cultural competency course that you could take. And so let's say you're a VP of admissions, marketing, whatever, and you're like, listen, I may have took a sociology class back in the day, but no one really ever taught me about this diversity and inclusion thing or a cultural competency or to do the equity work. It's a program that you can sign up for, and I think it's broken down over 4 sessions over a month or 2 or something like that. And you can get what you need in terms of building your professional development in that arena. So yeah, right now it's heightened. So there's tons of TED Talks, webinars, trainings. I started a private consulting company, so I'm doing this work externally for different groups now. I recently was able to speak with the St. Louis Cardinals. I just did a media company in Cleveland a couple of weeks ago. And so there's tons of consultants out there that you can work with and get this experience and get some information and some support.
And I think one of the things that, from the opposite side for like someone like me learning more is not being afraid of having conversations, not being afraid. Like, I think for a long time, I was afraid of saying the wrong thing just out of ignorance. And the only way I was going to learn is to say that and have people going like, hey man, like, it's really that cultural bias. Sometimes you don't even know you're saying, you said it out of no reason. And then to have that conversation, it's never fun to be called out and be like, oh man, I didn't realize I was doing. And the cool thing, and a friend of mine has joined the webinar. He and I, read a book together and we talked about it, and we had discussions. And I've been trying to call my family out on things that they're doing, and definitely not fun. Got smacked in the back of the head once or twice, but I'm having the conversations if it's hard or not. And I think everyone here may be in different spots of where they are with the conversation. But as long as you're continuing to have the conversation and moving forward, everyone's going to be moving in the right direction.
Yeah. I think without saying too much, me and Corey have a very different background and upbringing besides just like race. I think in the areas we grew up in, the things that we experienced in life. And so, again, having a relationship, I remember some of the conversations we would have around some of these things that they came up or just went over, or we would like grab lunch and just be out talking. Having a social circle and a professional circle that is both diverse will help you with some of these conversations, because when you have a relationship, like me and Corey have a legit relationship. So if Corey is experiencing something, he could pick up the phone and call me and say, hey, Turan, I said this thing or did this thing or I noticed this thing or this thing happened at the family reunion, want to process it with you. Right. But if me and Corey don't have that relationship, Corey might call me. I'm not picking up the phone. Like, well, I don't know who this guy is. Like, why should I talk to you about racism on my Sunday? Like, I don't want to do it. You alluded to a very good point where I think all of this begins with showing respect for one another, building interpersonal relationships, and opening yourself up to experiencing and learning about other cultures, not for the sake of saying that it's better or worse or right or wrong, but just being able to do that, because once you do that, now you're able to create empathy for someone. Yeah. So it really is based on my experience with Corey that when I'm looking at today's student and somebody wants to step into a room and say, well, those kids are from rural Missouri or Kansas and they don't care about this and they're never going to understand this, I can say, well, that's not entirely true, right? I think we got to afford the benefit of the doubt. But if I never have that relationship with a certain person or an experience living in rural Missouri, then my bias is always going to make me think that those people are that way. And it really becomes a those versus us type of deal. And you want to eliminate that as much as possible. So build genuine, authentic relationships with people. Ask yourself this question. If you want to, we can do this all day inside of 8 and 5. But ask yourself, when you look at your dinner table this year, last year, the last 3 years, who's actually been inside your house for dinner? What type of friends do you go out and hang out with? What type of movies do you go see? What type of books do you read? What type of businesses do you support?
Definitely. So really kind of the next thing is, I know there's been some questions asked here. Do we have a question? No? Okay. Okay. None. Oh, let me double check. Ooh. So just double checking a few of the questions. We will be posting some resources, and actually here what I'm getting to in the slide is I wanted to put our contact information, and specifically Turan's here. Turan is here. He's like he said, he started some consulting. He has a wealth of knowledge, and as you probably realized at this point, really easy to talk to. So that's really the first step in this, is having someone to talk to, having the resources out there. But then Josh and I are also out here as resources. If you're just if you're having trouble getting in contact with anybody, obviously we are a marketing relationship, or a marketing company, but what we're really here for is this conversation was about the conversation. It needs to happen. It needs to continue to happen. And that's what we're here for. But if you need anything from us, our contact's here too. But again, Turan's the one shining here. And I agree. I think Forrest said a little bit ago, this could easily be two plus hours of a conversation, and we don't disagree. We could sit here all day and chat and really build that agenda. But this was supposed to be that one quick conversation that you can get in, break up your day, start thinking a little bit, and then reach out if there's more that you need. Or I see some people connecting and talk about connecting in the chat feature as well. And that's what they're about, is making those additional connections, working together. The hardest thing, colleges were recruiting against each other. But, when we recruited, we were trying to find the students that fit our school the best. And it doesn't mean that, there's two schools that right next to each other, they may be totally different. It's about that individual experience for that student and what that's going to look like for them on campus. So working together, sharing resources, and going through that whole process.
Sure.
Josh,
Corey,
go ahead.
I didn't know if you wanted to, we got a couple questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to jump in those, or Josh, you can go ahead. Or
Go ahead.
Okay, so I think the first one was, how do you, let me get back over here real quick.
How do you suggest increasing diversity within your admission team?
No, the first one was, as a person of color, how do you battle being the person who always has to educate others, any resources for people of color? Well, I think, one, you have to know that that's not your responsibility. So you have to make the conscious choice to say, either I'm going to choose to provide you with this education or my perspective, or I'm not. Right. But I think one thing that we have to do as people of color, or for self-care, is to understand that that's not our burden to carry. For me, it is inside of my institution, because I'm paid to do that. Right. And so I know when I show up at work, I'm being paid to do this job. So I just have to have resiliency for it. For me, what I found to be resources for me is to have community. Right. And so I have a community of both educators and personal friends that I talk about race and just life things with. I always try to educate myself. So I'm reading new material. I'm coming up with different ways to address this, because my delivery method, my preferred delivery method, may not always be best for the receiver. I was a communications major for both my undergraduate and master's degree. So I truly, truly value the power of communication. So sometimes you have to adjust how you're saying, not what you're saying, but how you're saying, in order to deliver it. And that just takes practice. I think being a person of color, one of the things that was most helpful for me was something called the Social Justice Training Institute. And it was a 3-day deep dive immersion with other facilitators and very, very strong industry experts around this stuff. And I spent 3 days processing my own personal identity and how I show up in the world and what it means to be a Black man in America. And I haven't done that in so long, because I'm always trying to figure out what it means for other people. But it was 3 days. I got a chance to do some deep reflection, some processing. I was away from work. I was away from family. And that really helped me be comfortable in this space, because I started to ask myself and identify the things that I needed to work on internally, because I had issues, right? I had some bias. I had some things that were not always, the most inclusive. And so I was able to start to ask myself those questions. And then I was also able to better understand white supremacy and how it shows up in systemic racism, right? And that's a very complex conversation, because when you say those certain things, some people instantly think like, KKK, and then they're dismissive, right? They're like, I'm not racist, so that conversation isn't for me. But even as a person of color, understanding how I uphold white supremacy. Mind blowing. Right? I never had that. I just thought because I was a person of color, there was no way that was, going to happen. But I was able to recognize that. So that was very important for me. How do you suggest increasing diversity within your admissions team? We put out job postings in hopes of accomplishing this, but we don't seem to be reaching a diverse audience. Now, this is a little bit different, right? Because I don't know where you're at. Some schools just can't recruit people of color, right? Like if I'm up in North Dakota or whatever, and I got 1,000 students total, maybe 600 students total, like who wants to live there? So sometimes it's not always your institution. It may be like the area that you're around. But if there is the institution, I think some of the things that you have to do is eliminate the bias in your hiring process. So you want to make sure that you're not discriminating or showing if your culture doesn't look like it supports people of color, that could be an issue. Giving preference to certain people who come from certain schools, industries, or fields. You may have to open up that search a little bit more. There's a couple of different things that you can do to really improve. And so that's what you want to research is how to remove bias from our hiring and selection process, and how do you recruit more diverse applicant pools. So there's things that you can do inside of that, inside of the search process, the onboarding, and the hiring process that you can do to help with that.
And I think, Turan, kind of on that, I think there's also opportunities for your admission counselors to help recruit people to apply. I mean, we're on well, not during COVID, but we've been on the road together. We've met all these people. We've talked about our institutions. We've gone, on the caravans across the states and in these college fairs. There's opportunity to help recruit for, even just let them, hey, there's a job offering. I thought you'd fit in well, to really try to look and make them see the value of your institution.
Yep. There's a couple other ones. Black students should not, students' job to educate us on diversity. This is absolutely right? It's not your job of students of color, about marginalized identities, to do the education. Again, we're higher ed, so education is what we do. Pick up a book, join a course, do some stuff like that. A lot of times your institution will allow you to audit an undergraduate course and just take one. So take sociology. A lot of schools have created a diversity course for their students, so you can jump into one of those. There's a really, really good question in here and talk about if you do not fall into the black and white side of diversity, how do you navigate the gray area? I think this is really critical because, again, in America, we have these stories, right? And so if you look at the first story about Europeans coming to Americas and the indigenous people and population, that's a whole story and a history lesson around racism for that group of people. And then you could look at slavery in Africans. You could look at the concentration camps around World War II with our Asian populations, or when you think about the westward expansion and how Asian Americans were treated in that whole deal. And so I think that what I try to do as much as possible is you use the correct terms I need to use them. There are certain times when I'm talking about people of color. There are certain times when I'm talking about black people. There are certain times when I'm talking about classism, and there's certain times when I'm talking about racism, right? And so being very clear about what we're talking about and how we're talking about it. And I think that you have to diversify the group of people that are talking, because if you only have black and white people in the room, a lot of times the majority of the conversation is going to center around black and white issues. So it's good to have a Native American person there. It's good to have a Latinx person in there. It's good to have an international person in there, right? Because they're able to have their voice. And then that's what it really means about having a seat at the table. When you have that seat at the table, you have the voice at the table, it can shift the conversation dramatically, right? If you're in a room full of people who look like you and think like you, it is very easy to come up with an idea, everybody agrees, and the meeting's over in 10 minutes. It's harder to allow people in that room that are going to challenge your thoughts, that are going to force harder conversations. But everybody wants to use the tweet, right? We all want to do the hashtag. We all want to do the surface level stuff. But the difficult part is giving up power, right? And not looking at it as like I'm losing a slice of something, because it's enough for everybody, right? Or it's really being able to have an honest conversation and say, look, our leadership has been white males for 150 years. I think it's time we let some other people get in here and make some decisions, right? And there's no shade to the white male leaders who may be sitting at the table. But again, understanding your privilege and being how do I navigate that conversation as a white person is something that you have to do the work on, right? You can't feel like it's an attack on you personally.
So we are coming right up against time, and so I want to apologize if anyone we did not get to your questions. Again, the contact information is here for Turan. Hopefully, I've tried to leave it up instead of making our photos big so that our videos big, so you had time to write down or connect with Turan or Josh or myself. But kind of we really, Turan, we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Nothing but great feedback in the chat of, what I like about Turan, he breaks it down. He's simple. He doesn't like try to talk over your head. He's right there with you. And I saw it a few times in the chat. We really, really appreciate that. And I can tell right now, as you can see him coming through, everyone else that came here did too. So we really appreciate your time to come and be on the webinar, but really overall your time and everything that you're doing, as a friend, as a colleague, as someone working at my alma mater, and just as someone in the world. We really do appreciate that. And then kind of, this is usually where we have a few more jokes, but obviously this is a topic we don't. We really want to end with one that we end all of our stuff with is just be excellent to each other. And this right here, party on dudes for those that know it. Really at this time, I can't say anything else. Just be excellent to each other. That's all we need to do, and continue to have the hard conversations.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. It's been a great conversation. Like I said, if anybody has any additional questions, shoot me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to help out. I love ending on this because just be excellent to each other, be nice. If we could just take that, that little piece of just, hope and make sure that we're approaching these conversations, we'll get through this together. It's a tough road, but I think if it's everyone against all the isms won't last for much longer. So thank you all. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks, Turan.
Thanks, Turan. Have a great afternoon, folks.